Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Joey Barnett. I am a partner at WR Immigration. Thank you for joining today's Chatting with Charlie, EB-5 Investor Outlook. I, of course, am joined with Mr. Charlie Oppenheim, the Director of Visas Consulting at WR Immigration, who used to work with the Department of State, writing the Visa Bulletin for 2 decades. Charlie, great to see you.
It's a pleasure to be on the call.
Great. Well, Charlie and I, let's go to the next slide. Let's just go through it. We have a lot to talk about today, and this doesn't constitute legal advice. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out. And we work for WR Immigration. We are a full-service U.S. immigration law firm. We have over 40 attorneys, over 150 staff, and 10 offices globally. And we are consistently ranked as one of the top EB-5 firms and just U.S. immigration firms in general. And I was actually just nominated and will be the vice chair of the AILA EB-5 committee for this upcoming year, which is very exciting. And we are very much on the cutting edge of EB-5. And the information that you're hearing today, a lot of it is coming from the Department of State and from IIUSA, which is the Regional Center Trade Organization. There was a forum event in Atlanta, Georgia at the end of May, and both Charlie and I were there, and we spoke about this and about some other items, and it's a very exciting time in EB-5, and we're just going to get right into it. So let's move forward here. We're going to be talking about a number of topics. As we always do, we're going to talk about the Visa Bulletin. We're going to be talking about visa use to date. And then we're going to be talking about demand and supply for the reserved EB-5 visas. So let's first take a look at the Visa Bulletin for June. So this is for June of 2024. The EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act created new visa categories, new lines that EB-5 investors can qualify into. And for Chinese and Indian nationals, it actually opened up the door to a green card that didn't exist before because of the visa backlogs. So there are 3 new categories. They're all set-asides: the rural, which gets 20%, high unemployment, which gets 10%, and infrastructure that gets 2%. And even though there have been thousands of EB-5 cases filed post-RIA, USCIS has not yet adjudicated them. And because there have been not enough adjudications, the Department of State does not see that demand, and it therefore does not update the Visa Bulletin to reflect that. And because of it, it has remained current and is providing a very unique opportunity for individuals who are in the United States, in particular, who can file an adjustment of status at the same time that you file for EB-5. And the real benefit for that is you can file for an employment authorization document, which gives you unrestricted right to work in the United States, and an advanced parole, which allows you to travel. These are interim benefits that you get during the time in which your adjustment of status is pending. And so it's really great for those in the United States on F1 who may not have been chosen for the H-1B lottery, or maybe folks on H-1B who want a backup plan in the event that there are layoffs. If you file that adjustment while you are in status and there's a layoff and you can't find a new employer during the grace period, well, you're still able to remain in the United States because you timely filed that adjustment of status. And once you have the EAD, you can continue to work in the United States. And so it's a great, great opportunity right now. It's not going to last forever. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today. But first, Charlie, let me just ask you this. Let's first talk about the unreserved. There wasn't any forward movement for Chart A in the unreserved visa category in the June 2024 Visa Bulletin. But what did you hear at the IIUSA conference from Dr. Hanley? He's the data scientist who works in your old office, about what we may see with forward movement unreserved for China and India in the next, 6 to 12 months or so.
Right. When speaking with Dr. Hanley, it did not appear that there would be much if any, movement of the China date for the remainder of the year, that we may get to January 1st of 2016 by September, but it is extremely unlikely that it would go beyond that, and that hopefully there may be some movement in the India date, but that cannot be guaranteed by the end of this fiscal year.
And we know that Chart B estimates where we think Chart A will be at the end of a fiscal year within a certain amount of time. Are you anticipating to see some sort of retrogression in Chart B for China unreserved because of that?
Yes, based on my discussions with Dr. Hanley, it appears that there was the estimates that they based the application filing dates, which were announced in October, are not going to be realized. Therefore, they will have to retrogress the China application filing date. I believe it may retrogress to approximately July of 2016 or thereabouts. But people should pay attention to the October Visa Bulletin, which is typically when they will announce the new application filing dates for the upcoming year. But I do not believe that the China unreserved final action date will go much beyond July of 2016 during fiscal 2024. He shared information on the amount of applicants with pending petitions in the China unreserved category with 2016 dates at the National Visa Center, and it is an excessive amount.
Right. So there were so many Chinese investors in 2015 and 2016 that have been approved that the Department of State needs to kind of go through all of those cases. And there's so many of them that it's going to sort of prevent the forward movement of that final action date. Okay, great. Let's look at unreserved visa use so far in fiscal year 2024. So this is very interesting. This is data that we have from the Department of State. They put out monthly immigrant visa usage. And in the unreserved for fiscal year 2024, there's just over 14,000. That's a big chunk of visas. It's the most unreserved visas ever given to EB-5. And to date, they have issued only 8,359 of them. And it's great that it's up almost over a quarter from last year. There still remains over 5,000 visa numbers that must be used before October 1st, 2024. If not, those could be lost to EB-5 forever. And so that is a big concern. We need the Department of State to continue to schedule these visa interviews. Charlie, what is your thought on the ability of the Department of State to really maximize the visa use? What did Dr. Hanley mention about the Department of State's goals? And do you think that is realistic?
I think it's very realistic that they will use all of the unreserved numbers by the end of the fiscal year. The number use, particularly for China number use, has been increasing in recent months. Dr. Hanley, when I spoke with him, indicated that he believes that the Guangzhou will be able to be processing large amounts of Chinese visas during the summer months. And I know when I was chief, often the Chinese applicants would delay action on their cases until the summer months when their children were out of school. And then we often saw an uptick in demand. So I see no problem with the State Department using all of the unreserved EB-5 numbers this year, which is a very, very good thing and will help potentially reduce some of the China backlog.
Excellent. And that's what they have done actually for the past 2 fiscal years. And they have really gotten to just last fiscal year too, they did maximize the unreserved visa use. But in the past 2 fiscal years, they really have increased the issuance of visas in the late summer months. And so hopefully we'll continue to see that trend happening again in this fiscal year. Anything else you wanted to mention regarding this unreserved EB-5 visa availability? I think that's it from my end, but just giving you an opportunity.
No, I think that pretty much says it all. It is an extremely high limit with this 14,000, and it does present an excellent opportunity to reduce the overall backlog for not only China but India as well.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. Let's move forward. Okay, so this is data that was obtained by the EB-5 investor group, AIIA, and through their Freedom of Information Act requests. And we just put it in this bar chart, or I should say, IIUSA put it in the bar chart. Shout out to Lee. Thanks for doing all your great work. And it really shows, I think, in a very concise graph, the demand for EB-5 to date. And you can see that China is dominating EB-5. You can see that more folks have filed for high unemployment than for rural to date. Well, at least through November of 2023. And this just shows really the demand from China, from India, from rest of world, and what those percentages are between rural and high unemployment. And this is what I was talking about earlier about how not all of these cases have been approved. And because they haven't been approved, the Department of State doesn't see the demand for the visa numbers, which means that they cannot put any final action date in the visa bulletin. But we can see the demand based on the number of I-526Es that have been filed. And so we're going to get into this data a little bit more. Obviously, there's not going to be 100% approval rates. There could be age outs. There could be dropouts, things like that impact the visa number and the total visa numbers that are demanded based on these I-526E filings. And we're going to get into what that actually means for the visa bulletin in the future for the reserve visa categories. And let's go to the next slide. This is interesting because this was new data that we got from the Department of State. It talked about reserved visa number use through fiscal year 2024. And the first thing that he said was that there has been 17 total adjustment of status applications for post-RIA investors. So those reserve visa numbers have begun to be used, which will reduce the carryover for next year, but it's not enough. We are 2 years into the RIA, 2 years since Congress created these reserve visa categories, and we only have 17 green cards because of it in those categories. That's not what Congress intended. We need to see that picking up. There are adjustment of status applications that are pending at USCIS for investors with approved I-526s in visa categories that are current, and USCIS needs to approve those adjustment of statuses this year. Additionally, the Department of State should start scheduling visa interviews for those who are abroad with approved I-526Es because it's current there as well. And the chart that we see here shows how many set-aside petitions are currently at the National Visa Center based on country. This is only for the reserved visa petitions. You can see that over 160 have been received by NVC for Chinese nationals, yet only one case has been scheduled to date in Guangzhou for interview. That number needs to pick up significantly, and hopefully we will see that happen again in the summer months. I don't think, or we haven't heard of any sort of distinction from the Department of State that they, will be processing reserve visas less than unreserved visas or in a shorter manner. But what we're seeing just in practice is that they are. And so hopefully that picks up. Charlie, anything that jumps out at you with this data that we got last week?
Where it shows the amount of applicants with petitions on file at NVC. It's extremely important for these applicants to act in a very timely manner and respond by submitting any documentation which has been requested, because NVC will only schedule a case for overseas processing once it is 100% documentarily complete. And that is so if they sent you a notice requesting 5-7 documents, you need to get those 5 or 7 documents in quickly so your case can be scheduled. Typically, the National Visa Center finds that, unfortunately, applicants are sometimes very slow in responding with their documentation.
Right. And the other thing I remember that Dr. Hanley mentioned is that it only takes NVC 4 days to create a new case once it receives the file from USCIS. The issue is that it's taking USCIS several months to transfer the file to NVC, even though it's all electronic and it's just an email. It's not like they need to box up a paper file and send it over to NVC. It's just an email. That process needs to speed up significantly in order to maximize the reserve visa number use. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so this relates to the actual demands for reserved EB-5 visas. And this is data that we have only through the number of I-526s received as of November of 2023. So it's 6 months old. So I don't know how reliable this data is in terms of advising clients on, hey, what's going to happen, but at least it gives you our ideas and our thought process on how we would evaluate what a wait time or a wait list would be once we get those updated figures. And so the two big assumptions that we're making here is, one, that the cases are going to be approved, or a significant portion of them are going to be approved. And two, that the average family size per I-526 petition is either 1.5 or 3. We say 3 because it's the investor's spouse, and any unmarried children under the age of 21. 3 is, I think Dr. Hanley said the normal, it's like right around 2.6, 2.8 is generally what it has been historically. But we do have a lot of international students on F1 or maybe early in the H-1B process who don't see a path forward to a green card based on EB-2, EB-3. They're filing on their own. And so that is reducing the number of visas per I-526E petition. And what we can see is based on the approval rate, based on the family size, and based on the number of cases filed through November of 2023, the demand for rural area visa numbers can range anywhere from 1,300 to 3,000, whereas the demand for high unemployment visa numbers is higher, almost double, potentially 2,600 all the way up to nearly 6,000. And so what we're going to see if you go to the next slide is that there is twice as many cases filed for high unemployment than for rural, and there is half as many supply. And because of that, we are more likely to see a final action date imposed for the high unemployment visa category before the rural category. And this here just kind of talks about the visa availability moving forward from, I guess, the carryovers from fiscal year 2023, this year in fiscal year 2024, and what we may be estimating it to be in 2025. So that's this. Let's keep moving. And so when we put the supply next to the demand, this is a graph kind of showing that there is no overlap between the visa supply and demand for rural as of November 2023. It's possible that in the last 5-6 months, there have been enough rural cases filed to exceed the supply. We just don't know because USCIS doesn't share that data on a normal basis. And EB-5 stakeholders have to do Freedom of Information Act requests. And when USCIS doesn't respond within the statutory period of 20 or 30 days, then they have to litigate. And that is a separate process which draws out the ability for us to get those numbers and for us to be able to properly advise clients. But Charlie, when you were working at the Department of State, you were in communication with USCIS all of the time. They track this data, right? I mean, it's not like they don't have it. They're just not sharing it.
Correct. I would get about the middle of each month, the IPO office would provide me a list of the top countries of demand listed by calendar year and month. they would list it on a worldwide basis. And for the top countries I asked, again, they do have it, and it's exactly what they're providing in response to the Freedom of Information Act requests. So if they wanted to save them the trouble of having to respond to those, they could potentially post that data on a monthly basis so people would have accurate and transparent information on which to be basing estimates.
Was there anything else regarding this reserved EB-5 visa demand versus supply that you wanted to make sure that we mentioned? I know that you did speak at the IIUSA on this topic with Lee Lee and others in the EB-5 industry. I just want to make sure you have the opportunity to say anything that you may want to.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, all the reserve dates will stay current throughout fiscal 2024. They are likely, based on the slow pace of approving petitions and the fact that, as you mentioned, only 17 visas have been issued so far or used, it is unlikely that a final action date would be imposed before the late summer, if at all. So people can probably expect the categories to stay current through most, if not all, of fiscal 2025. But as this chart shows, it already indicates that the high unemployment area is going to require final action dates in 2026. My guess is a worst case scenario for rest of world applicants would be a January of 2024 date. And for China and India, high unemployment reserved applicants, a worst case final action date could be November of 2022. But I suggest that there is an option because the State Department is currently approving petitions in dual. So they're saying people are eligible to be processed under the unreserved or reserved categories in many cases.
I hear you. One, you don't believe that there's going to be a final action date for rural or for high unemployment in fiscal year 2024. And because of USCIS's slow processing, potentially throughout fiscal year 2025, right?
Right. And not before late summer in a worst case.
Late summer 2025.
Yeah.
All right. And then, so that was just one thing.
Then we can move into this.
Yeah,
okay.
Now we can move into this. So then the question becomes, well, when there is a backlog, what is your projection for when the final action date would be for high unemployment or for rural? And so what I would like you to do is kind of just walk us through this chart and where these numbers are coming from and what this horizontal orange line means, because that will at least give people your thought process as to how you sort of create or estimate what that final action date may be.
Applicants are often being approved with dual approval, so they're being approved to be processed under a reserved category or the unreserved category. And during the summer of fiscal 2025, the State Department in the Visa Bulletin should provide notice of what their projections of visa availability will be during fiscal 2026. At that time, I believe they will indicate that it is likely that there will be a rest of world high unemployment final action date, potentially a worst case scenario of January of 2024. And I believe that there will be India and China final action dates of worst case of November of 2022. But because if they do notify the public in the summer in the Visa Bulletin that there is going to be a rest of world final action date, those high unemployment rest of world applicants can opt to be processed in the unreserved category, where the category will be current, it will have a much higher annual limit, and therefore they can opt to be processed there without any negative implications. This would be a very wonderful thing, and it's something I proposed at the conference, because then it would allow both China and India to maximize number use under the high unemployment annual limits. And in all likelihood, instead of facing a November of 2022 final action date, they could have a November of 2023 final action date by the end of fiscal 2026. So this would be a very good thing if the rest of world applicants were to opt out and be processed under the unreserved category.
Let's go to the next slide, please. Because in here, there's an excerpt from a approval notice. And this is what Charlie mentioned, is that you're approved for both the unreserved and the reserved visa categories, whether it's rural or high unemployment. And what NVC is doing is they are issuing an election letter which says, hey, which visa category do you want to be processed under? And Charlie's idea and his solution to maximize visa use for post-RIA investors is let rest of world go in the unreserved category, elect to be in the unreserved category, which would lead more numbers to China and India, which are backlogged in the unreserved category. So the post-RIA investors, rest of world, they are current in unreserved. They can still move forward and get their visas processed or their adjustment of status approved based on the unreserved category, leaving more visa numbers for India and Chinese, thereby pushing out the imposition of a final action date. And that's what this kind of graph over here on the left shows is, we see the supply range and we see the demand range. But if you take out that rest of world demand, it's a lot closer to the supply, meaning there'd be less likely for a final action date sooner as opposed to later. Now, Charlie, and this is something I think is really important. You said we need to make sure to check the visa bulletin in the summer of 2025. Can you just repeat that again? Because I think that's really important. I think that was something that Dr. Hanley really made sure that we understood to look for.
Right. Typically, the visa bulletin will include information of upcoming visa availability. And so they should, in the July-August timeframe, in a worst-case scenario, the September bulletin of 2025, they should indicate what may be happening with the reserved categories during fiscal 2026. They provided this similar advice on a worldwide basis for all employment and family categories in the April visa bulletin. And again, this is the type of thing they should do in the summer of fiscal 2025, allowing the rest of world applicants under the reserve categories to potentially opt out and be processed in the unreserved category where the annual limit is much higher. And again, this would be very beneficial for Chinese and Indian applicants and allowing those reserved final action dates to be advanced at a much more rapid pace.
Thank you. And for sake of clarity, I just want these numbers that we have here, these are only related to high unemployment I-526s and supply and demand. This does not relate to the rural category, only high unemployment. So I should have made that clear at the get-go. All right, let's move to our next slide, which discusses estimates for minimum visa numbers for EB-5. This includes any carryover visa numbers that may not be used. So under the RIA, any unused reserve numbers that are allocated in an initial fiscal year can carry over to the reserve category in the next year. And if they're not used there, they can carry over to the unreserved the following year. Charlie, is anything jumping off the page here at you on these numbers? What is the annual allocation here? What does it assume it's going to be 140,000, or are there going to be unused family numbers that sort of carry over to increase the employment-based number limit?
Yeah, I think these are based on the minimum normal employment annual limits with carryover, but Dr. Hanley indicated that at this time, the State Department expects there to be large amounts, from what he was talking about, large amounts of unused family numbers, which is a little bit surprising to me, but it's a very good thing in terms of employment applicants because it will, any unused fiscal 2024 family numbers get added to the minimum of 140,000 employment limit for fiscal 2025. And that is what's been happening in recent years, allowing the much higher employment limits. So it's a very good thing. And so these are impressive limits. I mean, the 11,000 in unreserved, that should allow much of the backlog for China and India to be worked off. And these reserved categories will also provide a lot of numbers and help the processing of the reserved cases.
Okay, thank you. Well, that is our chatting with Charlie today. Let's move forward one more slide. If you guys want to stay informed, please check out our website, our newsletter. You can sign up with the QR codes here, or you can contact me if you have any questions regarding EB-5. We are filing a lot of cases. I think we have filed, if not the most, probably in the top 3 to 5 number of I-526 cases since the RIA went into effect. We've gotten hundreds of approvals to date, some in as quick as 3 to 4 months. And we are really, really happy to see EB-5 is back. But as we discussed here, we need to make sure that the government continues to push these cases forward so that we use those reserve visa numbers as soon as possible. And that will minimize the imposition of a final action date sooner versus later. So I hope you guys found this enjoyable. If we go to the next slide, you'll see my contact information, jbarnett@woolstorf.com. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And one item I want to make sure I mention is that even though we do see the likelihood of some final action date in the future, in fiscal year 2026, the big piece of advice that I have is if you know this is what you want to do for your family, and EB-5 is your path forward because your EB-2 or EB-3 priority date is so far in the future, and EB-5 is what you want to do, you get your spot in line. That is the goal, is you file quick so that in the event a final action date is imposed, well, then you're at least within sight of the front of that line. You get your spot in line by filing the I-526. That is what your priority date is. So you make the investment, you file your I-526, you get your spot in line, and if there is a final action date, well, if you're in the United States, that's okay because you have your adjustment of status pending. Maybe you're using your EAD, you can work wherever you want, and you just bide your time for the final action date to become current. That is what I'm recommending to folks inside the United States. For folks outside of the United States, you are subject to USCIS processing times and making sure that a final action date is current at the time of approval. And again, you get your spot in line by filing that I-526. So get in the front of the line as quick as you can, and we would be happy to help. So thank you so very much. If you want to contact us, my email is jbarnett@woolstorf.com. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to work with other attorneys, and we are doing a great job of filing EB-5 cases. We have filed probably more than any other law firm at this point, post RIA, and we would be pleased to help you and your family get green cards. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Charlie. It was great to see you in Atlanta, and hope to talk with you again soon.
Take care.